Welcome to the We Are Film podcast with your hosts, Cameron Gallagher and Zach Bouye.
Awesome. So welcome to the We Are Film podcast, listeners out there. So we have a guest now. This is sort of a fun thing. We love bringing on a guest we can. So you said Karl Janisse, right? That's how I pronounce it?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, sweet. So we have Karl on today. We're going to talk about a lot of pretty interesting things because you've done some pretty cool stuff that we are just kind of chomping at the bit to ask you about. And so I guess I want to just start off by people that have no idea who you are, sort of what you do, and maybe just a little bit of idea of like how you got into the film world.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, both Cam and Zach. This is very awesome. I'm super happy to be here. Man, how did I get into film?
The ultimate question, right?
Yeah. To be honest, I feel like when I first started in film, my answer was very big. Like it was very like, oh yeah, it's like this language that you can express the intent of your soul, and like it's a more delicate lexicon than what you can describe with your vocal cords. And I think as time has gone on, I've gotten more honest with it. And it's literally like, I remember when I was in high school, film class was the one class where you had the sort of like automatic hall pass. Like you could just be doing anything. And if you had a camera, then it was okay. It was like, oh no, we're making a movie. And it'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, just set it on fire over there.
Yeah, classic like art major just mindset is just like, I'm gonna do the thing that's fun and I get like paid and or credit for.
Yeah, I and it just sort of ballooned from high school. Like I started my own photo studio when I was in high school, because I think I remember I like got my first camera when I was like 9 years old. It was a Canon A1, and was just enamored with the idea. I would take all the family photographs and stuff, and I did photography for a little while. And funny enough, I ended up like over consumerizing it. You know, I would like shoot headshots for money, and I would shoot weddings. I had one summer where I did like 40 weddings, and then I just got so sick of it. I was like, I'll never have a wedding myself. Like I never want to step on another wedding ever again. I never want to be there. And a friend of mine was going into film, and I was like, okay, cool. This seems like something I'm also into, but I don't have to like be so obsessed with running this company out of.
Yeah. I feel like that's the thing with like, so like we do wedding stuff like that too, and it's like the most intense stuff, and it's like the more like commercial work you can do and like distance yourself from that, you're like, wow, this is just like a ton of stress taken off the plate, like.
Which is funny because I just second shoot for Cameron. Like he runs the business, and then I just that's my hall pass class. Yeah, right. is doing the weddings, because it's like he takes all the heavy lifting parts, and I use it as a time to like kind of just have fun and just see what cool shots I can get with brand new people in a brand new situation. And the commercial work is my 9 to 5, so it's like, I guess it'd be all of our 9 to 5. It's funny to just say that to a group and not talking to someone who doesn't know what's going on in the video world. But I was gonna say, I really think cool to have have the wedding. Nice.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I know there's a little delay, I think. So you're obviously a DP, right? Now, have you branched out into any other stuff? Like, have you done anything else, or is it mainly just like strictly DP, that kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, well, so I started on set as a technician. Like, I mean, I was like a PA for a day, and then someone walked up to me and was like, "You're a big dude. Like, we need more grips. We're going to train you to be a grip." And I was like, okay. And it's like, what's a grip? And I very quickly would be like the guy, like, oh, we need a tall C-stand with an arm and a bag over here. And I'd be like, okay. And then I would walk to the truck and be like, hey, man, you seen a C-stand around here? And he'd be like, yeah, right there. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, sorry, I didn't see that. Like, this is a C-stand. But
just like play it off like you can't see anything.
I did the same exact thing. Yeah, like my first shoot, it was just like, can you go grab the car? Like there's a thing of cartellinis. I need one of the. I'm like, what isn't that like an Italian dish?
Yeah. You like open Uber Eats, you're like,
Yeah. I guess we can order in, like, sure.
Yeah, but I rose up as a technician, and then because I always was into cameras, and I would start bringing my stills camera on set and shooting some behind the scenes. Eventually, someone like called in sick, and they were like, "Hey, we need a second AC. Like, can you come in AC for us?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, sure." And learned how to like slate and learned how to do all, sort of like taking care of the lenses and the camera and whatnot. And rose up through the camera department and did that in like the commercial world and the indie world for a while. And then after about a year and a half, I was focus pulling, and I was starting to work with like more union DPs that were doing their like, off season shows kind of thing. They're like smaller shows that they would like fill their winters with when they would go do bigger shows in the summer. Created good relationships, and then I started going to work on set in the union pretty quickly, actually. And then from there, like that sort of passion I always had for photography started to really come back, and realized that like the life of a technician was not the only thing I wanted for myself.
Yeah.
And I think it was about 2015 or 2016, I like sort of made the decision to be like, okay, this is something I'm pursuing full time. I'm joining the Canadian Society of Cinematographers. I'm going to apply, and eventually I ended up getting in as an associate member, and then just sort of working from there. And since then, I've definitely branched out into some producing, tending to like help in the producing aspect if it's a project that like I really want to see come to life. We had a pilot for a TV series that I was helping to produce that was going to go shoot in Cape Town. And it was this really interesting story that was being written by these two amazing writers in South Africa, and then a friend of mine who's a writer in Canada. And it took place right at the end of apartheid, and like was really aligned with some of the stories that I wanted to tell and some of the values I wanted to embody in my work. And so I came on, and like I was like, whatever I can do to help get this off the ground. So I came on to help produce that. But I guess I juggle the two, but really like artistically, my passions align more in cinematography and in a visual medium.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like everyone's kind of like, you might dabble in other stuff, but like you find that thing where it's like, okay, this just feels right, and like it feels like it's the natural path of like I'm getting there, right? I'm moving forward. There's no side movement, all that kind of stuff. So no, that's awesome. And then obviously, the big thing that we wanted to really touch on, because I think this is such a new, and like Zach and I had a conversation about this before. Is obviously the virtual productions, and obviously now more than ever, this type of stuff is that much more important, and I think beneficial. And I also think there's critics to it. Like even myself, I have some ideas in my mind where I'm like, well, what is this like, or is that, what I mean? There's definitely like those things that kind of creep in the back of your mind. So I'll let Zach take it, because I know he probably has more questions, or he probably has 10 million questions about the virtual sets.
Well, yeah. So Cameron originally shared me a post. I think it was like just one of those generic posts, Instagram accounts that kind of share like a lot of filmmaker things. And when you look at the top video, it's like you see the close-up of the woman, and all of a sudden like it looks like the camera pans around her perfectly. A big gust of wind comes around. It's like tracking onto her. But then you look at the video below it, and you realize the camera is mostly staying still. She's the one moving around, and the digital set behind her is simulating the entire space moving as like air comes in. And the first thing that obviously comes to my mind is Mandalorian, because that's the biggest thing that's really kind of brought it to life over the last couple of years that it's been on the show. And it really kind of made me think, it's like, wow, it's like this is something where it's not just for giant multi-billion-dollar like companies can use, and it's like this can be utilized in so many different ways. And of course Cameron was a little bit more like skeptical. He was just like, I don't know, does this like complicate things? Does this make it a little bit more difficult? Because yes, it's like you can't shoot a lot of different places at a lot of different times. If it's like dead of winter and you need like a summer scene, is it useful for that? But then of course I started to think like, okay, how many people need to be involved in order for this project to even start? It's like, who builds the set? Who controls the set? How do you program something like that? Is there a particular set of people that come with a set like that. And the list will just keep going on and on and on.
Yeah.
So let's start in the basics of just like how did something like that how did you approach a project like that, or how did someone approach you to come on to a project? Like, what were like kind of the building blocks to get to there?
Cool. With the whole world of virtual production, there's a lot to unpack. Even the description itself is a bit contested, and I think maybe we can touch on that in a little bit. But for me, like, I guess I'll try and rope some of my backstory in to make sense of how I ended up there, because I grew up as a gamer.
Okay.
Yeah, friggin' love video games. I was like, that was my whole life as a kid. I remember as I was getting into film, I almost like had to like cut the addiction off, and like I refused to buy any new consoles or any new games because I was like, I actually have to go out and get a job and a career. Meanwhile, esports exploded 10 years later. I was like, oh no, what do you mean it could have been a career?
Yeah, right. You're like, I missed out.
Yeah. But so gaming was always a part of my life when I was younger, and then getting into film, I guess I learned an entirely new set of skills. Like the ability to tell a story in cinema is derived from our ability to suspend disbelief and sort of take an audience on this like on rails experience where you are, as the filmmaker, are in complete control of what they see inside the magic box, right? Like this box that's around me right now, you don't know, there could be like, I could have like 100 dogs over here or something. I could have something crazy right here. You'd have no idea. And that's cinema. Whereas in a video game, you're just like, and that's it. You just look over. And so it's two very different storytelling techniques. And the exciting thing about virtual production is it's sort of bringing those two mindsets together. And it's bringing a lot of the gaming and even some of the broadcast and events world that's using these technologies and bringing it into film. And so to dive into the specific shot that you were talking about, how I got involved in the project, that project was a workshop that was hosted by the Directors Guild of Canada. And so that specific shot you're talking about where the world rotates, that was invented, like that, the person who came up with that was our director, Heather Hawthorne Doyle, who is one of our workshop directors. She was awesome. And I was chosen to be the cinematographer of these 8 different pieces that we shot over 2 days, these like 8 microfilms with 8 directors. And her sort of way of approaching her little 2-page sequence within the volume was, I want to break it, which I loved. Like some people approach it and they're like, I want to know exactly how to like get my exact, story to come through in my exact film. But her little approach was like, for the first hour, we're going to try this shot and we want to break it. And if it doesn't break and we get the shot, then we'll shoot the rest of it. And like, that'll be the story that comes out of it. And so it was a really unique and fun experience to try that shot. In pre-production, we talked about different solutions for how to make the actor rotate, how to make the environment rotate, how to synchronize those two elements.
I could imagine that is a brand new learning curve.
It was, but it still feels very much like film, where it's like you kind of put it together with duct tape and then turn the duct tape away from camera, and then you shoot it. It's like, it works, right? What was the Simpsons quote? Like, it's a horse is a bunch of cats taped together, sort of thing. I don't know. So I have to give a lot of credit to both like Heather, who's the director, Laura Bannister, who was our VFX supervisor for that shot. Like, she was the one doing sort of all the cueing. So she would sit at her own monitor and would cue the Unreal station, like the brain bar that controlled the entire volume and the environment, and then would cue someone actually physically operating like a turntable that the actress was spinning on, and then would cue each one until they both synchronized. And then it was me and the director sitting behind Video Village. And my gaffer was cueing a lighting sequence that would go off around. It was fun. It really
is
fun.
like a Rube Goldberg machine, where it's like one thing has to be triggered and you can't have one thing without another. I know that, like, actually just you saying that you had a gaffer ready to like trigger a bunch of lights. That's something that I've seen where it can be automatic, where it's like programmed into a system where it's almost like a automatic camera system will go and follow the same track. But you actually had to have someone manually triggering all these different stages. That sounds like a circus of a time, but it is pretty amazing to see it all come together.
Yeah, and I mean, what you're identifying there is, I think, really valuable for people to be aware of. And so, I guess to go back to like kind of what you were getting at before about virtual production and like how it's changing things. Essentially, when you boil it down, what we're using is a game engine, like we're using Unreal, which has all of these different plugins and options for devices in the real world and in the sort of 3D world to talk to it. And we're using that game engine to create a sequence that is believable to the camera and is like a sort of final pixel image. If we wanted to, if we had the time in pre-production, the lighting sequence that you're sort of identifying there, that could have been pre-programmed because it has DMX control inside the engine. The turntable itself could have been encoded along with the motor, so the motor could have driven up via like a Cat6 Ethernet connection to the computer. Sorry.
Temporary pause.
Sorry, yeah, I was just getting a call. I can pick it up later. Yeah, so the cool thing is eventually, yes, you can do this entire sequence digitally. The reason why we didn't approach it from that aspect is honestly, it requires more kind of human labor in the pre-production process. And given the unique circumstances of this particular shoot, in that we were shooting 8 films over the course of 2 days, each with a 2-hour window to actually roll the camera. A lot of that pre-production stuff that if we had only isolated one film, we could have accomplished, we just couldn't like put in the legwork to make those work. Because essentially, to give you a bit of backstory, we had 3 weeks for the entire VFX team to build out 4 environments that the 8 directors got to share, and then specifically like isolate in those environments the shooting locations, and then render out the assets close to camera at a higher resolution. So you would sort of like, if I can give you an idea of what the whole pre-production process is like, it's like you go on your location scout, you're in a forest, you say, okay, cool, this spot in the forest is going to work for this sequence. Someone walks up, someone talks, someone gets shot, who knows. Once we pick that location, we have to make sure that everything around is sized and textured properly so that the trees don't look like oddly larger than the people, and that when the closest tree is kind of near focus, not in focus, but near focus, it appears like it has a natural level of texture and depth, rather than like some video game assets, which we're all aware of, are like not so natural looking, like very low poly. And that was sort of a very consuming part of the pre-production process. And so because of that, we decided when we got on set, we're just going to do it manually. We're going to do it the way we always would do it. But the exciting element will be the fact that, yeah, we're spinning inside the engine and spinning the actress and not actually moving the camera.
Now, so in that kind of, you're talking about location scouting and that sort of stuff, what does that look like? Like, is this a natural environment that is being captured with, a ton of high resolution photos, or is this completely built, in a computer? Like, what is that workflow?
Oh man, I love that question. And to be honest, that's actually in my bit of downtime right now. That's something I'm exploring a lot, because I actually walked away from this experience in the last few ones I've had shooting in volumetric stages, realizing that like environmental capture is a huge part of what my end product will look like. Even as a cinematographer, like I have to just be a part of it. Similar to how like you kind of have to know who your second unit DP is shooting your plates. Like, yes, they're hired by production. Yes, they could just be some guy on the other side of the world that needs to make it look like we're in Dubai or anywhere else. But you have to really trust that person to kind of complete your image. And so the process that we took with this particular project was we had 4 game environments that were pulled down off of the Unreal Store. I think all 4 of them were from the Unreal Store.
Yeah.
And then they were polished using assets from Brushify and Quixel. And so just sort of a quick aside is like Brushify is one very small company that's quickly growing to be able to develop like high res assets to use in game environments and film environments. And then Quixel is a really cool company that got purchased by Epic Unreal like a few years back. And their mission was to go out and scan the world. And so that kind of dives into what you're getting at, which is like literally they would go around and like they'd go to Utah and just scan rocks in Utah and like scan mountains and like little bits of sand texture, and then now you can have those assets and drop them in a game. But if, for instance, you knew that there was a place on Earth that you wanted to shoot, but for whatever reason, it could be a global pandemic or just the cost of it, you couldn't actually send a whole crew there to make that movie. You can't send your talent there. If you hire a team, you can go and scan an actual location, create a mesh, texturize that mesh, and then build a game environment out of that inside Unreal, and then project that in a studio. So you can kind of go about it either way.
So
Yeah,
eventually in the future, it won't be like looking on Airbnb to find nice rental spaces. It'll be scrolling through virtual environments to see like, okay, does this place fit the vibe that I'm going for? And of course, when it's a virtual environment, you can also edit and adjust scale and placement and surrounding objects, which is going to be just insane. And I can't wait for that, because it kind of eventually I feel like it'll just blur the lines between, oh, this is a game engine, and it'll be like, this is a film studio engine or something like that,
like
where
a
it's
virtual film studio where it's just completely. Yeah, I think one of the things that blows my mind, what I was thinking about in this entire concept that would be so beneficial, is like, because we ran into a case where it was like, wow, this actually would have made sense. Is we were we shot a short film, and we went back and we had pickups to do. And we had shot this shot. Well, we needed a shot where basically a photo was on a table. Well, we went back to the location. The table was sold. So now it's like, okay, now we have to go find this, this or that. And it started occurring to me while watching the video, as I was like, imagine if you needed a close-up shot for a pickup. You're like, you know what? It's the Justice League movie, right? There was like, infamously the bunch of reshoots. Well, instead of having a reshoot where you need to go, in some of these cases, rebuild sets, the idea that you could have this virtual set and walk on it and basically capture, you could theoretically do an entire production, but the idea that you could do these like pickup shoots at such, I would assume, maybe not now, but at some point, a lower cost, that you would be able to replicate something that wasn't, or that was there originally. And that, to me, was like this eye-opening, because again, I was kind of skeptical at first. I'm like, oh, well, you're sort of possibly losing a sense of this or that and that practicality. But then I'm like, wow, this could create the gap between the real production elements, and then be an extension of its arm, less of a replacement, I guess. How do you feel about that? I was gonna say, do you feel that? Do you like using it as a full replacement? Do you like using it as an extension? Like, where's, like, what is fun and what have you kind of toyed with?
That's a great question. And, it's funny. There's, as you guys have identified, like, we're sitting here talking about it. A lot of people are out there talking about, like, virtual production. Oh my God, like Netflix just hired a head of virtual production a few months ago.
Yeah.
Studios are paying very close attention to how this technology will affect their workflows in the future. And I know some people have sort of touted it like, oh, it's just a fad. Like, obviously we're in this hype cycle right now. Everyone's talking about it, everyone's posting about it. I sort of was adjacent to the, like, some cinematography fads. I don't want to call it that, because I know a lot of people that work really hard within it, but 3D and HFR things that like popped up and didn't really stick around for a while. And the reason why some people are seeing it in that same sort of light is because it's very tech oriented. It's being sort of cooked up in the R&D lab. But at the end of the day, this is effectively a cost saving mechanism. And it is something that both producers and like financiers and insurers will be the ones pushing eventually. Like, by the time the artists are bored and don't want to stare at TVs anymore and like want to go back into the real world, it'll actually be the people that are putting the money forward and putting their necks on the line and risking themselves to create these highly volatile investments like films. They're the ones that are actually going to push this. And so,
absolutely, yeah.
To kind of dig into your question, where I think this will eventually land is, you're right on the money. Like, second unit this solves so many annoying problems that I know I've experienced shooting second unit before, where you're like, you have this, you have like a menu. You're given a menu of shots, and you're like, you just have to go make sure you shoot all these pickup shots. It's like somebody's hand holding a key prop, somebody's face reacting, and you're always like fighting with main unit to get the right elements. And like, oh crap, they have to shoot on this. Like if you're in studio, they have to shoot on this set right now. Okay, we have to go over to the other set and try and shoot something else over there.
Yeah.
And what a volume gives you. And I think everyone, like at its most basic form, if you're not shooting a movie on Mars or on Everest, and it is just a ladybird or a moonlight, something that really should be captured on location because that's what breathes the sort of life into the story. Even still, the shots that you've missed off your schedule because you needed to like focus on the moment and not worry about the pickup shot, you can collect all those together, and with the right environment scans, if they're taken in advance and rendered out, you can shoot them on a volume within a day. Like it's what was craziest about our experience shooting, 4 short films a day in 2 separate environments. I remember chatting with some of the directors, and like we were talking about like, okay, like how quickly can the environment get loaded into Unreal? How quickly does it go on the screen? Like what if it crashes? How quickly does it take to get it back up?
Yeah.
And
those are always the things that I think of is crashing and problems. Those are the two things that I'm like, you gotta look out for those because it's a game changer.
Yeah, no, and by all means, like it's still something that's at this current moment. I guess I'll date myself. Version 4.261. Some of the stuff is kind of held together with a bit of duct tape, and Epic Unreal is actively pouring money into trying to solve some problems that are being encountered on stages. But the answer I would give those directors, and like sort of like how long does it take? It's like it takes infinitely less time than it would take us to fly to Utah or to fly to the top of an icy mountain, even to go to the top of a mountain. I don't know if you've ever, I'm sure you guys, because you're like, you have more experience getting out there, actually dragging a camera to some crazy location. But when you think of like the giant behemoth that is film, when it's 200 people on a set, going to the top of a mountain is unheard of. Like you just can't even do it. How do you make sure that you're fulfilling like the top 3 lead actors' riders based on like where their trailer sits adjacent to their shooting location? You just don't end up going there.
Not even.
No, it's funny you mentioned that because I was just listening to the Deacons podcast and they were just talking to a location manager, and I thought it was interesting that they were talking about like, oh, well, there's some places that you just can't go to, and it's like, and this kind of is that gap of like, it may not replace certain things, but at the same time, it can extend where film production could theoretically go that it could never have gone in, obviously things like Mars and different planets, but even things that are in the real world, but we just can't get a 200-person crew up or, on a mountain or wherever it may be.
I think my favorite things, specifically a Star Wars references in mind is in The Mandalorian, they used the virtual set to replicate the inside of a cave when that could have probably been just built out in a soundstage. But then I remember this really specific shot from one of the newer Star Wars where they had Rey out in the middle of a just giant open desert just plain, and then behind her, like behind the camera, there was like 1,500 people with like campers and vans and all this stuff just because they needed to get a shot of her running in the desert. And it's like, I feel like that maybe could have been something done, and then you just add a little bit of dust in the air and then you could have made the cave, but instead it swapped like that. And how much of a cost difference would have those two things have been?
Yeah. And like that is, for your listeners and viewers out there, that is the crazy thing about getting involved. For any of those who, maybe if you guys have more experience on indie style sets where it's run and gun, which like I love personally, like that's actually why I got into film. I remember the day I decided to be a filmmaker. It was actually after watching Gareth Edwards' Monsters in
Monsters.
Yeah.
I've never actually seen this, but I've heard about this several times. So I must have to see this at this point now.
And you know what? It's funny because I would actually argue that it's a really good precursor to where this conversation is going, because essentially Gareth made a giant monster movie by taking a crew of like 9 people, including his actors, through 4 countries in Central America and the Caribbean, and sort of like just shooting out all these sequences in jungles and beaches and on rivers. And essentially they're just trying to escape these alien monsters, these giant creatures that he himself, with a small team, like composited in these giant VFX animations. And that's why like it sort of got to the height it did, because he was amazing. He had a great mind for what VFX is and where it's necessary and where it's not, which is what led him to doing obviously Star Wars and Godzilla. But yeah, like it understanding that, unfortunately, like as your budget gets bigger, as you get more backers, you get a studio, you get bigger distributors, the trailers grow, like the idea of your circus, like this whole unit of vehicles, this entire like moving transient village has to travel with you. Like people have assistants have assistants. Like unfortunately, if you are a Star Wars, there won't ever be a day where it's just, you know, yourself, a camera, the lead actress, and the director in a desert. It just doesn't happen. And so it gives credence to doing it in a studio.
Yeah. Now
I was going to say, unless you're shooting tests of the movie Drive, where they actually used test footage because when they wanted to actually shoot footage of him driving, the producers wouldn't let him doing, so they're like wouldn't let him do it. So they're like, looks like we're going to use our test footage because it's the only good stuff of you actually driving the car.
Oh, really? I had no idea, actually.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that a while back. I thought that was kind of funny. One of those like, well, that was weird, but I think one of the things that a lot of our listeners, because we're a lot, you know, it's more indie filmmakers, kind of obviously much lower budget. And I think one of the questions that a lot of people might have is, what is the advantage to this over a green screen and having, you know, that type of, you know, virtual set in a sense? What have you found is the big advantage? I know it's a tough question, because then it's like they could almost, at least again from somebody who hasn't been there, you know, it may seem so simple to be like, oh, they're almost the same thing, like they're just, you know, like a composite in a sense. But
yeah, I mean, I think an important distinction is like, where are you putting the bulk of your resources? And this is something that I think anybody who's approaching this as a storytelling tool should consider, because if you're doing green screen compositing, for the most part, you're deciding that after you rolled the camera, a lot of your final decisions are being made to complete your shot. And I think that's important to identify. Obviously, there's previs, obviously there's concept art and sketches, and depending on how deep you want to go with it, you might know exactly what you're putting back there, and then it'll probably turn out really well, minus a few things you have to adjust. If you put that bulk of the effort into pre-production, the money, the time, the people actually going in to design it, and then when you show up on set, you're at a final pixel stage, which final pixel just means that when you look down the camera, it's like, cool, it's done. That's exactly the way we want it to look. It matches. Then you've done a lot of that R&D before you've asked everyone to show up and capture something. And there's like 2 schools of thought here, because I know some people are looking at this and going, yeah, but sometimes we show up and it's not ready and we have to do this part as well. And then it's like, oh, we just spent twice the money. It's like, that's true. It happened on The Mandalorian kind of often. Like in my journey, sort of like exploring virtual production, I hosted a panel discussion on it for the Canadian Society of Cinematographers. And I actually got to speak to one of the camera operators who's a CSC member from The Mandalorian. He's like, yeah, like we would throw up what's called like the chroma frustum. And so the frustum is your like dancing render window that tracks with the camera. So like you see the LED walls, and then essentially there's like this one box, and that box is like high res, and that's matched to your lens.
And then it has the blurry edges as it's keeping everything else low cache. I'm assuming that's why
exactly.
It's like that.
Yeah, it's like trying to create this like 80-20 load of like 80% of your GPU performance is sitting in this box. It's the highest render quality possible. Everything else is just a lighting asset, which is very beneficial, obviously, and very efficient. But so like he'd be like, yeah, we'd get there, and it's like we're running out of time, something's not finished. You just throw up the chroma frustum and be like, I guess we'll finish it later. And that is always an option and will probably still end up occurring no matter what, because human beings are flawed and we can't make up our minds. And there's a lot of people making decisions on things. But I guess to go back to your original question, like, why would I promote this to people rather than green screen is I think there is a certain intrinsic value to forcing yourself to see the final picture before you decide to ask everyone to show up and shoot it. And, you know, if I can be candid, like, it is more of an indie film mentality to be like, I think I know what I'm going to put there. But, you know, just due to knowledge and experience you haven't gained yet, maybe you're not fully confident in that. And because there are so many amazing resources now on YouTube available for free to learn how to, like, literally tell an entire story just in these game engines without anybody else's involvement, for you to spend, you know, 2-3 hours a night in between whatever else you're doing, to sustain yourself, like, slowly working towards getting to that final pixel result where you're like, I know this is what I want to see on screen, and then bringing that on set, I think has a lot of value. And I think not only to yourself as the creator, but also to everyone else who shows up, your cinematographer, your producer, your entire team, your first AD, your actors, everyone actually gets to see what it's like to stand on Mars and look down inside the viewfinder and be like, oh yeah, we're on Mars.
Yeah, that's so true. I never thought about that as it's more of like a different mindset, and there's that sense of like, I know what I want, not like I'm not really sure what I want, or I haven't figured it out yet.
I kind of so actually right up until like a couple minutes ago when you started to really break it down, it, like, everything that I've heard has always been like, oh, it's like a green screen replacement, but it sounds more like it's closer to just shooting on a real set than compared to a green
Physical
screen
replacement, yeah,
where you could almost use like a combination between the, like, a virtual set with an actual projected, well, I guess an illuminated screen. It's, you know, you were saying once you get that shot, you don't really have a lot of options to change it unless you're going to go and manually roto out somebody or whatever it is that you want to be seen. But it also kind of opens up the ability to use a green screen, but then have one of the cameras that tracks the motion camera, just like for like Avatar. But the way that the virtual sets are just being developed in general, you can shoot on a green screen, and then you could always just drop that virtual set in post, or you could make adjustments and change everything kind of later on, which is something that I don't think a lot of people think of, but just all
kind of
these
using
different
both
practices
as an augmentation. Yeah.
Either way, yeah, it's just helping get everything to a more cohesive workflow in the end, which I think would be pretty great. I don't know if you've really thought of anything or have worked with anything like that where you've used like a motion tracked camera where you can later put in the visuals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're identifying there is something that there are certain things about virtual production workflows that excite me the most, I would say. And maybe this is a good time to, like, sidebar and offer my own interpretation of what virtual production means. And it's funny because
definitely.
I was in a clubhouse room literally earlier today with some VFX soups and studio heads. Like, there was some from the UK, Canada, and LA, and actually it was all about virtual production and like where it's going. And it came up in the room. They're like, what do you guys call, when someone asks what virtual production is, what do you say? Like, what are we calling this? Because it's so, is it this? Is it this? Is it, have we been doing it for 20 years? Is it brand new?
Yeah. What is the actual term for the, I know it, but I keep forgetting it, of when you actually have all the screens up and it's in camera. What's that?
So that at least candidly, I refer to it as like an LED volume. So it's like volume refers to the fact that you are capturing in 3 dimensions the locations of the screens, of the camera, sometimes the actor, sometimes the lights, but it's just volumetric, which means, like, volume, obviously, like you think of math class, it's 3 dimensions. And then LED being the thing that projects your background. But like virtual production, what I've currently been going by and what I've been describing to people as is like, when you consider it being virtual production, it's because you're using something, and a part of your production is rendering out virtual assets, digital assets, in real time. And the importance of that is like, you think of how, up until recently, perhaps like a Pixar movie was made. You do your rough SketchUp, you get your low res render, you go through your sequence, and then you press a button. And I think we've all heard the like Toy Story story of like literally when they tried to make Toy Story, or the first iteration of Toy Story in the 80s, they did the math and they're like, if we press render right now on an hour-long or a 2-hour-long movie, it will take 9 years. So they decided to wait 9 years and develop their artistic techniques more. And then it took them like 4 months to render it instead of 9 years, because that's how technology goes. And now we're at this stage where we can get really, really high-res graphics, high-res lighting using active ray tracing to do things in real time. And so that includes like virtual scouting, previs inside a game engine. So you get like all your storyboards or even full like camera sequences. You can map out your entire shot or your entire movie inside a game engine. And then anything where you're actively tracking things in 3-dimensional space. So that includes motion capture, any kind of motion capture, whether it's facial, body capture, capturing the movement of the camera, and then LED volumetric displays, which is where you're doing final pixel imaging. You're projecting a final pixel result behind the camera and then shooting it as if you were actually there. So anyways, that's my like description of virtual production.
That's great, because I think a lot of people do have that. They might not understand, or it could be a misinterpretation of that as like, what is a virtual? Yeah, because I mean, somebody could say like, well, is green screen a virtual production, or is any type of augmented sort of, I don't want to say augmented reality, but augmented visual. So I think it's good that there's a clear, concise like definition in a sense.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, like, anybody who's watching this or listening to this, I would like anyone that wants to chime in and disagree and like offer their own interpretation. Right now, we're all open to it. Everybody that's working with it, like, please, let's set the boundaries and set the terms so that this doesn't like fly off the rails in terms of like the brain. Yeah, that's the way I've come to describe it, so that you can delineate between, well, is post VFX virtual production? It's like, not so much like if you're tracking the camera, you're doing things in real time. Yes, you can describe it in that sort of sense, but the way we've come to understand it is like things have to be happening in real time.
Just virtual
because that's really where
post-production.
you unlock that like natural skill set as a filmmaker to interact with things, right? Like we all picked up a camera at some point in our lives and went, oh, wait, what do I do if I put it down here, or if I like move it over here? And if it wasn't real time, you couldn't do that. And so I guess to go back to your original question of like, what excites me most, it is actually that aspect of tracking the camera, because as a cinematographer, like, there's been a few times now where I've shot something, and because we've had to do post-compositing, we either had to lock it off or do a very, very basic, very smooth movement that we could like track and encode. And we can never really get playful with it, and we'd always had to add that later. So if you want to make something look handheld, like, we've all downloaded that like handheld plugins where you have to like make something look shaky in post. And
I like the effect of you track a shot that's very shaky or that you handheld, and then you apply that to a still clip. I don't know if you've done it that way.
Yeah. And honestly, what I love about this technology more than anything is not the fact that I'm, shooting on LED screens. It's the idea that like everything I do in that space is saved forever in like a 60 kilobyte file. So like I can take a file with me. Let's say, you think of the 9-minute one take sequence from Children of Men. Imagine if like after you said, okay, we're done, we're printed, great, I'm going to put a thumbstick in, and then I'm going to take that camera operating with me for the rest of my life. And I can literally like plug that into a virtual camera and play that sequence out over and over again inside a game engine for the rest of my entire life. And
it's so wild.
Yeah, it gives a really cool, at least for me, it gives a really cool.
I didn't even realize it was that small of a file. I realized it's like all you need are a couple points, and then you just drop it in any orientation. But yeah, that's pretty efficient.
Yeah, and like think about this is the way I'm looking at it. Like you think about the way pro athletes like become the best at their game is like they watch replays, right? They watch themselves play and they figure out where they went and where they went wrong and like what happened. And we've like, I'm probably not the only filmmaker out there to watch back their own work and gone like, oh man, I wish I didn't do that, or like, why did I do that?
Yeah.
And now having that little extra step and that little extra tool to actually have a fully encoded version of like, this is exactly what I did. This is exactly where the camera went and why it went there. And being able to pull that out, who knows, like in 40 years, I can refer back to a shot that I'm doing right now and pull up that reference.
That's incredible. And that type of technology, I think, that to me is also game changing because it adds an element of like a time, like for a prime example is you see a lot of these, I'm a huge fan of like when they go back and rescan these like old film negatives and like have these nice, like 4K versions of movies that have almost no business being on a 4K version. Sometimes you're like, what is this? And it blows my mind, but it's like because there's this slightly timeless nature to it, and obviously people could go on and on about that idea, but it's almost the same. It's like you have this tracked emotion of this camera, and now you have this portion that could, in the future, who knows, maybe you use that in 20 years because they're I don't know, maybe you make a film and they're like, I don't know, rescanning it or doing something. You're like, you know what? We can go in and we can fix this camera movement somehow. You know what I mean? And it's like you have that information. Obviously, that's really far-fetched, but it's just, you never know. It's probably pretty far-fetched to think that they could scan film in the future this way, that kind of stuff.
You know what's not far-fetched about this? And this has actually happened before, and it will definitely happen again. Although with I think the rise of SVODs like Netflix and Hulu and HBO, maybe it's not happening as much, but the way television has happened before the rise of streaming networks is like every season is your last season unless you've been greenlit for more than one season, especially your season one, like your pilot through season one. Your writer, your writer's room, your story direction, you're writing the end of your show and the continuation of your show. And you're like waiting for ratings to come in mid-season to determine which one you're going to greenlight, go into production with, and then print and ship out weeks later. The reason why that's relevant is it happens time and time again where it's like, yeah, TV series are these very embedded, like long-running plots with like interweaving storylines. And so imagine you've got the finale of your season one. You're doing this long Steadicam shot down a hallway, tracking this character, like moving through different rooms as, let's say, they're running from somebody. Then in season 4, you want to show off the fact that there was somebody in that hallway that is only relevant to the audience now that really was never written in the first place, but, stories.
Yeah.
You can now go back in, take that camera data, and literally like do that move again, and then pan left, go into the room, and find the person. And it's like that.
That's
like,
mind-boggling to me.
Just watching, watched WandaVision. A lot of Disney talk today. And just realizing it's like later on, it's like, oh, okay, I see now. It's like this thing that's happening in this last episode. It's like they filmed this to film like the first sequence of like episode 4, and it's like they knew they had to like go in and tie in, and then being able to just separate, go off, and do all these different things. It's like the in Community when it's like at the end of an episode, it's like you realize it was the monkey stealing the pencil, and they can go back and follow the monkey into the vent as everybody's arguing in the middle of the room.
I mean, that it blows my mind that you could change something, from a story perspective with something that's, again, I want to say it's small, but it seems small. Like here, like you're saying, you have this, flash drive with this little bit of camera data that, well, in 5 years, who knows, might need to revisit this for this episode of TV. Like to me, that is like a new just world of possibilities in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess where we can leave this off is from time to time, I guess, push it in this like nerdy gaming direction where, you've got Matt Workman who's out there making like Cinetracer and the cinematography database. And I'm like, I really hope that a generation of cinematographers growing up in 10 years can actually go into a video game and like download the camera sequence from like Skyfall or a camera sequence from like Star Wars and literally like press play and watch it and then try and do it on their own to learn from it. Because up until now, all we've had was you sit at home and you watch a movie and you're like, oh man, how did they do that? Maybe try and find some behind the scenes of the movie's that new. And then just try and do it yourself or like interpret your own style. But we're getting to this stage now where you can actually like fundamentally access those elements on the indie level. Anybody watching this, like we're getting to the stage now where if I shot something in a week and just uploaded that camera tracking file, you could download it, put it into your game engine, and then replay that camera movement.
Yeah, downloading actual assets from a movie is going to be the new like prop hunt.
Yeah.
Yeah, and definitely, I mean, Matt Workman, he's awesome. I met him a couple years ago back in, where were we? We were in Texas, and some of the stuff that he was talking about is just like, dude, this is way above what I can understand when it comes to any of this. But no, he definitely was I actually just tried Cinetracer not that long ago, and I was pretty blown away. It's been pretty fun. I think it's still beta, right? Or
Yes.
I'm right? I think so, yeah. But pretty incredible stuff. But actually, on the education, I want to switch gears and kind of just wrap up in a minute here. But I want to talk a little about the, I think it's Pocket Film School, right?
Yeah.
So for people listening, because obviously people are into filmmaking education, kind of talk about Pocket Film School and sort of what it is, and just kind of, give the listeners like a good overview, I guess.
Cool. Yeah. So Pocket Film School is an online film education hub and resource that myself and 3 other co-founders created about 2 years ago now, I think. And it was honestly born out of a few different realizations. We were producing indie and then like just sort of less than union films, like mid-tier budget films.
Yeah.
And we realized that a lot of our crew that was coming on set was kind of just out of school or was still learning. And there was this mind-boggling thing where we're like, how did someone, walk out of a $30,000 education and not understand these basic things or understand how the way a set works or like get these sort of basic tools? And we were, being communicated to saying, yeah, wow, they never taught us this. Like we never learned this in school.
Yeah.
And we're like, oh man, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so we actually set out at first just to start to collect our firsthand knowledge in film and like be able to impart it. And then as it grew and it grew and it grew, we were like, okay, cool. This is actually like a full-on how to make a movie from start to finish course. Like literally from writing and story development, where you start working with a producer, how you stop shopping it around, how you start packaging it with a director, if you're going to direct or if you're bringing in a director, how you start getting cast and bring your talent on board. When do you bring in the DP? And then like walk it all the way through editing and then to exhibition. And after about a year and a half of like shooting these lessons and then putting together all the written content and the tests and putting it up and building a platform for it, we built Pocket Film School. And it's the 4 of us along with 8 other teachers that kind of teach everything through the basics of filmmaking. And the entire goal, honestly, is to like lower the barrier for people who want to get on set. If you can't afford both the time commitment of going to film school or the monetary commitment, or if you're not even in a position to, like, let's say, we're super privileged. I am very privileged to live in North America where I had parents that were able to help me afford like at least first year of college before I dropped out and ended up just jumping into film straight up.
Classic,
but
right?
Yeah. But I'm very privileged to be in that position where like I know I've also had the great opportunity to like take my Canadian heritage and co-produce in places like South Africa and India and Sri Lanka. And there are places that don't even get that like adjacent knowledge flow. Like growing up outside of Toronto, you've got American productions coming through and like just ad hoc, you're learning so much by being next to their sets, on their sets, knowing people that are working with them. And so it was our way of kind of like trying to democratize film education a bit and saying that like $30,000 is way too much money. Like that's crazy for an industry that doesn't require a diploma. And most of your skills will come from your own ability to exercise your firsthand knowledge. That was our motivation with starting it.
Well, I love it. And I think it's great for, I mean, obviously we're going to have, the podcast show notes, that kind of stuff, because I do think it's a great mindset for filmmakers. And that's, what we try to do, and a lot of other, obviously, YouTube channels try to do, is try to help educate people from real world experiences on, what it's like to do these kind of things and stuff that you sometimes don't even know or ever hear about, whether it's in school or on YouTube and stuff like that. So I think it's awesome. I think it's just a great, I just think it's a great thing that you're doing. I think it's really exciting. And I think our listeners in particular and people watching on YouTube will really enjoy that and be excited about it. So
I definitely love the filmmaker community, and it's always about like helping filmmakers like learn, be creative, make new things. And it's just like, it's not a lot of other industries can really do that, where it's like, oh, you can't do this because that's my thing. And it's always like very positive, and it's just like, oh, you like doing this thing? Like, well, we can do this thing together, and then we can make something really amazing, and we can save money while doing it.
Yeah. And I honestly, like, from the bottom of my heart, like when I started in film, I was lucky enough that it was right on the cusp of like the digital revolution. So like the red camera had just come out, and I was just sort of, I had sort of like pushed myself in at this funny moment where you had a lot of like more traditional people that like hadn't had experience with this digital way of telling stories. And they wanted some young kid who would spend their night, like myself, on Red User and read all the manuals and figure out how to use the camera to like play with the robot that was on set now. It's like, he can work the robot and we'll just go back to making movies like we always did. And unfortunately, up until recently, like up until this whole YouTube SLR revolution, like access to knowledge to tell stories in film has been super restricted. And kind of what you were saying, like it doesn't have to be that way at all. Like there doesn't have to be that barrier to being able to express yourself with this sort of language and be able to tell a story visually. And it's honestly a really rewarding part of my life and my career. Like I remember when I started out, someone was like, oh yeah, if you can, if you can do, then you do it. And if you can't do it, then you teach. And I was like, that's so backwards and ridiculous. Cause like, that means anybody who's learning is learning the wrong thing.
Right.
And doing Pocket Film School has been this really cool balance of like, I'll take some time off and then push all the knowledge out that I've gained, you know, on my more recent set or something that I've picked up, and then go back and actually keep working in the film industry and gaining that skill set and like crafting and sculpting that knowledge and then keep passing it on. And I think everyone should do that as a part of their career. I think we should all sort of participate and help each other.
Yeah, because if you're a full-time teacher, then what are you doing for how are you making films if you're teaching film the whole time?
Well, I want to thank you again for coming on the show. And so how can people get in touch with you, follow you, like that sort of stuff? How can people get involved in any way? Pocket Film School, all that sort of stuff. Yeah,
so thank you. Like Pocket Film School, it's pocketfilmschool.io. You check out our website, or you can just do pocket.film.school on Instagram. If you want to follow me, it's just my name, Karl Janisse, KarlJanisse. I'm sure you guys are going to have it below.
Yeah.
At Karl Janisse on Instagram. And then, honestly, if you have any questions, I'm totally open. Like, shoot me a DM. I'm always happy to have these conversations. If I have the time, I'm always happy to answer questions. Feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on again, and I appreciate it. And we'll say goodbye to all the listeners and watchers out there. So.
We Are Film. The We Are Film podcast is brought to you by the Black Mountain Visuals Podcast Network.